Snow drove like salt against the wagon's flank, and the road had become a white seam in a country of nothing but wind. Nora Briggs crouched low beneath the canvas, her breath fogging the sheepskin that wrapped Caleb's thin shoulders, while the team ahead stamped and strained at the traces. One wheel had splintered where the axle met a frozen rut. The iron band hissed like a small animal as it freed itself and fell away. Everything that mattered in that wagon, the tin kettle, the patchwork quilts, a battered tin box of Samuel Bridger's letters, shifted and settled with a small, accusing clatter. She leaned out, teeth clenched against the sting, and lashed the broken wheel with a rope that had been her father's and now smelled of tar and smoke. Snow pressed at her eyelashes and turned the ends of her hair to brittle filaments. Caleb coughed, a little sound that might have been a laugh if laughter were possible in that weather. He pressed his face into the sheepskin and found heat there. For the first hour, Nora had let herself answer the soft rhythm of the boy's breathing because it was proof, small, stubborn proof, that this journey was not simply a funeral procession. "Keep the canvas, little one," she murmured, half to him and half to the wind. Her hands, already numb at fingertips, found the kettle and set it between their knees. The iron stove, boxed and strapped in the back, was their only real hope for warmth once they found shelter. Its face was black with soot, and its belly heavy with a memory of fire. She had begged and bartered for that stove in a town an hour's worth of hard riding from where the Bridger farm lay, and it had cost them the last of the cash they'd come with. They were more debt than owners now. A bell sounded, faint and lonesome. Elias's mare's harness bell, like a piece of a far-off chapel. Then a shape detached from the white, with the deliberate patience of someone who had learned the land in small, patient breaths. Elias Crow reined as he came within calling distance, his jacket buttoned to his throat and a mail satchel slung crosswise. He did not look as if he had expected company of this sort. His face wore the blue-rimmed weather of someone who slept with his coat on. He left the mare to stamp at the snow and came up the path with a rope coil in one hand. "Rut it out," he said without a question. Wheels split. Nora had the spare pegs and the wedge, but not the iron band. She let herself be wished toward the wagon, let Elias's hands lift where her own would have done, and she watched the way he worked with the steady, economical movements of a man who made his living with the road. They set a temporary brace, struck flint for a bit of tinder behind the wheel so the men could warm their fingers, and spoke little while they bored the frozen sawdust out and bound the axle. Caleb's cough grew more persistent as the wind moved like a searching thing across the plain. Nora's hands worked, but her mind walked away to the house that waited, the Bridger place, long empty, with its crooked porch and the iron stove that Samuel Bridger had written of in the last letter she had read aloud to Caleb the night before they left. In Samuel's slanted hand, the house had seemed a living thing, the good beams, the low eaves, the cellar where winter kept its own breath. He had written them the house would hold if anyone would hold it in return. She had taken those lines as both map and promise. When the brace held and the team tugged forward again, the world opened to the house like a half-remembered story told in the dark. The road dropped into a shallow bowl where trees arrested the wind, a ragged plume of smoke rose from the Bridger chimney, a thin, stubborn finger against the wrong sky. For a moment, Nora did not trust it. Smoke could be the last sign of trouble, a flag from a burning ruin, but it might also be what her heart wanted, proof that a hearth still breathed. They drew nearer and the house loomed, low and squat, its clapboards a tired gray. The porch sagged in the middle, and one shutter dangled at a crooked angle. The iron stove's kettle hissed as they took the canvas down, and Caleb's eyes, red-rimmed from the cold, shone with something like hope. Nora unhitched the stove crate with hands that trembled from the work and the cold and the weight of a life she had not yet decided to name again. She thought of the letters shoved into the tin, of Samuel's handwriting, and of the wax-sealed packet he had told her to keep until the house felt like it belonged to them. Inside, the house gave up a breath that was not entirely empty. The parlor smelled of old dust and something sweeter, dried lavender tucked in a drawer perhaps, or the ghost of soap. Snow had found cracks in the window sashes and left its margin there like wash. Nora set the stove in the center of the room and began to haul kindling from the barn with the measured carefulness of someone who knows how little fuel will last. Nails came free with a reluctant metal wail. A beam needed lifting, a corner needed chinking. Their bed, one pallet and a trunk, and the quilts that still smelled faintly of Samuel, sat beneath the window where the light came thin and blue. Caleb watched, his small hands prying open the packed letters as if they were a trove of treasure. Each envelope had Samuel's name in a slanted hand. Some bore the flourishes of a careful man. Others were browned and rough, as if he had been writing with the world against him. Nora let him read aloud a few lines, adjusting her voice to be rougher or softer as the passage demanded. There were mentions of crops and the creek, of a woman with a good laugh, of a debt paid with a hog and a loaf of bread. There were also notes that carried an undercurrent she felt in the marrow. A man worried about being old, about the house standing empty, about promises. The first night they lit the stove was small and miraculous. Flames took with an almost grateful shush. The iron stove ticked and sighed like a beast settling its bones. Smoke curled into the chimney, and beyond it into the cold sky. And outside, that flag was visible for any traveler, a sign that someone kept the hearth. Nora sat with her fingers near the stove's heat until she could feel warmth return to her palms. Caleb slept, face loose with exhaustion, and for the first time in months, she let herself imagine a length of days in which the boy's cough would not waken before dawn. Word traveled by small channels on the frontier, by a rider's nod, by the trade at the general store, by Elias returning with a sack of flour and a sideways tail. Elias came more often than was strictly necessary, bringing mail and the patience of someone who had seen many startovers stall in the cold. He carried news on the way in, and carried away wood on the way out. He was a man who knew many roads, and how names stuck to places. When he looked at the Bridger house, the expression on his face was an economy of regard, not mere curiosity. "It's not the first time Bridger's roofs have been closed," he said, standing once by the stove as Nora stirred the stew. "Folks round here remember the Bridgers. They remember more than a farm. This place keeps a way of doing things." Nora bristled at the easy sentiment, but she did not deny the relief that rose in her chest. She let the stew bubble, thick with root and the last pieces of salt pork they'd carried. The kettle steamed like a small, patient chimney. The aroma itself seemed to insist upon life. Mary Dean arrived on a day the sky loosened to a hard-fashioned gray. A woman bent under a bundle and child tucked to her breast like a bird. She came by no grand entrance. The two met at the creek, where Mary had been mending a broken wagon wheel much like their own. Mary spoke in a voice thinned by hunger and by the practice of keeping trouble tucked inside. Her infant's cheeks were as pale as the inner lip of a mushroom. The child's cry was a small sound that stirred all the rooms in Nora's chest. "We took a wrong road," Mary said. There was a humor to the admission that made Nora like her at once. "Thought I'd find the mail house. Thought I'd find work." "There's always a dry bed and a share of soup," Nora said, before she had time to measure the words. She had not meant to sound so certain, but the house's new warmth lent courage. "The stove's only been set." Mary's gratitude arrived like a physical thing, a hand pressed to Nora's wrist, a brief, fierce warmth that spoke of a mother long trained to borrow small mercies and call them hers. She remained a week or two, mending, sewing, watching the infant sleep with a strict tenderness that drew Caleb nearer. He learned that if the baby fussed, a small wooden rattle and a singing of nonsense syllables could hush it. The house learned too. Its boards relaxed beneath new footsteps. The parlor's corners stopped collecting the exact shape of absence, and a chair that had not borne weight in years began to creak again. Nora kept to work with a steady, practical devotion. She mended roofs, drove pegs, coaxed life from a small garden plot behind the barn, and learned how to read the stove's dull notes, how it called for a log and sometimes answered with only a whisper. Each task was an argument against leaving, a reason to keep sheltering the boy who'd grown into her world like a sprout into a place after frost. Caleb unearthed the house's history in small ways. He found initials carved on a beam, SB with a small star beneath it. He found a child's toy, a wooden horse, its one ear worn away, and he placed it back on the windowsill so that when a light came through the glass, it shone with a better story. At night, Caleb would press his ear to the wall and pretend to hear voices of the past. Nora would listen too sometimes, but learned more from silence than from the past's supposed mutterings. The house had a memory, but its memory was mostly a collection of practical things. A place where a nail was left, a hearthstone scuffed, a cupboard that had known the weight of jars. Elias became the house's messenger. He brought a small stream of people that summer and into the thaw. Miner Joe, a man who rode freight and mended harnesses for a living, brought a load of shingles and insisted on sleeping in the loft to keep watch through the first heavy nights of rain. Joe told 100 small stories while he worked, about a stagecoach that had tipped along the ridge and spilt luggage like confetti, about a fox that had learned to steal eggs at night. His laugh was short and sharp, and when he slapped a beam into place, Nora felt as if the scaffold of life could be trusted again. The letters, however, remained the house's secret throttle. Nora kept them in a tin box beneath the quilts, a place where Caleb could bring them in secret and read aloud with theatrical inflection. In one letter, Samuel Bridger had written of his father teaching him the iron stove's heart and how to patch a roof in 3 breaths. In another, he had scrawled a sentence so small and fierce that Nora felt it like a closing of a wound. Keep the place warm. Let no one think they've been laid aside. The phrase lodged itself under her ribs. Let no one think they've been laid aside. She turned it over in her mind until it became a kind of rule. The winter's thaw came slowly, in fits and shudders. At first, the earth only sighed beneath the snow and held its breath. Then the creek broke out with a sound like a ribbon being torn. Mud took the place of crisp cold, and the house's porch sagged and settled as if it were waking. Life returned in small, unremarkable pulses. A calf trembling to its feet in a neighbor's field, the smell of fresh-baked bread at morning, a child's bare feet at noon. With those returns came small reckonings, debts to be named, loose agreements with men who promised help in exchange for labor, and the legal prickle of deeds that might or might not hold in a frontier where memory could be both witness and betrayer. One day a man in a gray coat came riding, and his horse's flanks were marked with the dust of long roads. He carried papers wrapped in oilcloth and a mannered patience. No marshal, no judge, just a man who had come seeking an ancestor's name. His questions pried at the house's comfortable quiet. "Bridger," he said, "is this Bridger's place?" "It was," Nora said. "It is now." She had not meant the claim to sound as absolute as it did, but the house's presence lent a kind of boldness to her tone. He unrolled the oilcloth slowly and produced a thin, folded paper, an old sheriff's record, yellowed and careful. On it, in a cramped clerk's hand, were inscrutable lines and a single curious heading: "The farm where nobody decayed." The mouth of the man who carried it made a small line. "A local legend," he offered, as if that made it less strange. "Signed and filed. The sheriff recorded it, 91. Nora did not like the phrase. She felt it hang in the room like an accusation and a promise at once. It carried the kind of attention that could turn people's curiosity into something sharper. Yet it also told her another truth. The house had a name and a history larger than her own passage through it. "Meanin'?" Caleb asked,
because children will ask the blunt question that adults smooth with tales. It means, Elias said after a breath, that the place keeps people in mind. Folks round here figure you don't bury the worthy dead and then toss 'em to the dirt like old coats. The Bridgers kept a way of doing
things. Sheriff wrote it down like he'd seen it. Or he liked the name, Joe said, already making a half-joke of the solemnity to ease the air. He set a plank into place, and the house accepted it without complaint. The weeks after the thaw focused on work that was inward and stubborn. The roof needed redoing in one corner, the barn's floor required fresh boards, and the cellar door had swollen in its hinges. Nora bartered eggs and garden produce for a length of sawn boards. Elias traded a favor he owed for the sound of nails and an extra pair of hands. The work itself became a kind of liturgy, a set of small acts that repaired not only beams but memory. Each new board was a sentence in a conversation that stretched across years. Then, as if the house itself wished to speak, Caleb found the wax-sealed packet. He had been in the loft, a place of dust and sunlight where old trunks exhaled the scent of cedar. He found the packet wrapped in oilcloth beneath a floorboard loosened by a mouse or by time. The wax still had a soft glossiness, as if it had never fully relinquished the heat that closed it. It bore Samuel Bridger's seal, a small, cracked horse carved into the wax, and a hand-pressed injunction in a curved script. For the ones who keep this house warm. Nora felt the blood press to her face when Caleb carried the packet down. There was a hush at the stove. The house seemed to hold its breath along with them. She cut the wax with a knife, careful as if handling an animal, and drawn from within came a collection of pages folded and written in that same slanted hand. The letter that lay on top was not one of the farm's casual bookkeeping entries. It spoke in an intimacy that made Nora's chest ache. Samuel's hand wrote of winters so cold that snow could keep a body from spoil, of neighbors who died at the wayside and were tended by whoever could tend them, of a code, not written in ink, but taught by gesture, by the passing of bread. If a soul comes to our door, he wrote, we lay a bed, we lay a name upon the board. No one is left to the grave's hunger like an untold story. Let this house remember. There were other things folded within, a list of names, a small hand-drawn map of the creek and where to find dry wood, and a short admonition sealed with Samuel's final flourish. Keep the place. Keep it bright enough that no one thinks they have been set aside. Nora sat with the letter in the stove's glow and felt the house press its evidence against her like a hand on the shoulder. The words were not a legal claim, not a deed. They were a covenant of sorts, an ethic committed to the boards that made up the place. For Nora, who had known being set aside, who had once risen from a bed with the urgency of one who sleeps light to begin with, Samuel's injunction landed with the weight of a calling. It changed things in increments. Nora found herself measuring kindness by whether it would leave someone warmed at night. When a man came through with a fever, she set aside the room nearest the hearth and fed him thin broth until his sweat cooled. When a traveler left behind a child for a few hours while he tended to a pressing errand, Nora watched the child with the sort of vigilance born from having been watched when she was small. Mary, who had once been the needy one, began to teach Caleb how to stitch a seam so it did not pull taut and break. Miner Joe, whose hands had always been more used to hammer than to cradle, learned the slow attentions of mending an apron hem. There were other legacies embedded in the packet. Tucked among the letters was a small folded sheet, directions to the title held in a ledger at the county seat, and a note from Samuel to one named Clara Bridger, a request that the house be remembered by those who might one day claim kin. The name Clara Bridger was one Nora had heard 2 or 3 times in Elias's passing references, an elder in the valley who had the sort of presence that made people unburden themselves. That autumn, as leaves browned and the first edge of frost returned, a rider came who carried not only mail but a purpose. Clara Bridger arrived in a calico dress that had seen better days, and a hat that shaded a face which the years had made into an open map of hard weather and stubborn joy. She stood on the porch and looked the house over as if reading it, her gaze pausing at the stove where the iron's black face shone. "You, Briggs?" she asked, and the name felt like a weighing. "I am," Nora said, and the house seemed to answer inside with the comfort of a hearth remembering its name. Caleb ran to meet Clara with the wooden horse clutched in his fist, and she took him in her arms as if he were a small oar for a boat she'd been watching from shore. Clara's presence was not a legal act at first, but a kind of slow unrolling. She had a ledger, she said, that the county clerk had given her to look over, and there were signatures and filings that might make the house less of an ambiguous claim and more of a thing with a name and a right. But Clara's interest ran deeper than ink. She listened to Nora read Samuel's letters, and she sat with them on the porch late into the evening, her shadow long across the boards. "This house," Clara said once, her voice low as a bell, "is a thing people remember when they're too tired to remember anything else. You kept it. You fed it. That is work with a kind of holiness." Nora had no need of platitudes, but Clara's words were the kind that filled quiet spaces. She spoke of the sheriff's record, the curious phrase about bodies not decaying, and she shrugged as if the words were not literal, but were meant to measure something larger. Men will think it means cold keeps a body. Some will think it means folks buried right and tended well. I think it means the same thing as your Samuel wrote, nobody cast aside. The sheriff wrote it down because he saw people live like they belonged. The ledger Clara produced later did what papers do. It made plain where hands had once scrawled the name Bridger, and where the county clerk had penned a line. There were spaces where signatures would fit, where a deed could be formalized, so that the house would no longer be only memory and promise, but also a thing with a line of ink and a sound of law. Clara, careful and particular, reviewed the documents with an eye that had seen many such matters handled badly. Her fingers traced the map Samuel had drawn, and then rested on the seal. "It will take a day at the clerk's," Clara said, finally, "and a good bit of talking, but I'll see it through, if you'll have me." Nora's answer came not as a yes in the abstract, but as a slow affirmation in her bones. To keep the house meant being present for it in the long, small labors of life. It meant the stove would need tending through another winter. It meant Caleb's cough required attention that might be costly at the doctor. It meant a willingness to hold open the door for those who might come, and sometimes demand more than could be spared. It meant a community of work. The house continued to live, and as it did, the talk that had circled it like smoke settled into names and faces. Neighbors brought in harvest, and sometimes brought in grief. A widow's bowl, a lad's lost papers, the bundle of a man ill in the next valley. Nora found herself learning to listen for where the line between keeping and taking was crossed. She learned to measure compassion with the same precision with which she set a board true. The stove taught her by its needs. Too much wood and the house choked on smoke. Too little and its bones shivered. In that way, the Bridger house became something like a small hospital for wishes, places where people could go to be warmed and mended. Its name, once peculiar and threatening, now read more like a promise, a place where no body, no person decayed into forgetfulness because someone kept the light on. People arrived, sometimes with the frank request of need, and sometimes with the awkwardness of those unused to asking. She received them, first by the stove, then by the ledger. She learned the difference between charity and belonging. The latter required work and the willingness to be known. Still, there were nights when fear sat heavy in her. She had come from a life that taught her the small toll of holding to anything. To keep something, one must first be willing to be held. Samuel's letters kept returning in thought like small metronomes. Keep the place. The phrase was both a blessing and a test. When the rain came hard and the barn held water in a place it had never leaked before, Nora's mind moved to the ledger and the ink and whether law could be as reliable as the hand that hammered a board to a joist. She could imagine a future in which the house was hers by paper and by practice, and one in which it would remain an island of goodwill. Elias brought both news and a measure of the world beyond the Bridger Valley.
He told of people who traded their names for land and of others who fled because the price of standing still was too high. He had a way of speaking, the caustic patience of someone who'd seen many failings, and also the odd, stubborn loyalty of someone who had stayed. He did not put his hand on Nora's shoulder without asking. He learned what softness she could bear and what reserve she needed, and in return he offered the kind of assistance that required little acknowledgement. In the winter that followed Clara's visit, there came an evening when pipes of light shone from every window in a way that suggested a house was not simply alive but humming with work. The stove's iron was warm enough to sit a pot of stew. Caleb's cough had softened to a sleep sound that let Nora sleep too. The letters lay in the tin beneath the quilts like a collection of small ordinances. Someone had left a loaf of bread on the porch that morning with a note, "For the Bridger house, keep warm." Elias nodded at the note as if its simplicity were the truest currency. Nora sat by the stove that night and read Samuel's admonitions again. In the margin of one letter, he had scrawled a single sentence: "If a house remembers, it can make room." The sentence, simple and nearly stern, became a rule by which she measured the house's service to others. When Mary, returned months later with a child older now and a husband's partner she had found in another town, Nora welcomed them with an easy chair by the fire and an invitation to stay until they could find work. Maria cried once at the table, silent tears that tasted of relief and shame braided together, and Nora set down her spoon and offered a hand. This was the life of the house, small economies of mercy that required little trumpet. Word of the place
gathered more than travelers. Local men came to mend fences and to deliver an extra cord of wood. Women came with preserves and jars of pickled things whose sharpness made the house sing. In time, the Bridger house filled with the low, continuous noise of living. A child's voice rehearsing nonsense, the clink of a spoon against the iron, the soft, percussive footfall of someone who had learned to carry their grief in a pocket rather than wear it as a cloak. But even as life thickened, there was always the ledger's reminder that a house's warmth was not merely a matter of heat, but of names kept. The sheriff's recorded phrase haunted them, not as a literal claim about bodies, but as a declaration of an ethic. The people who came to this house would not be permitted to fall into the creek of forgetting. That principle steered Nora in small, precise ways. When a widow came seeking a place to sleep between harvests, Nora offered not only shelter, but the pantry shelf that bore their stores. When a man arrived with frostbite on his fingers, she dressed the wounds without a dramatization, shaping her care into something that would not draw undue attention. The measure of love, she had learned, was in ordinary reliability. There were moments of doubt. Once, under a moonless night, Nora dreamed of a world in which the house's hearth had gone cold because she could not find enough wood. She woke shivering, palms slick with fear, and rose to stoke the stove as if the fire were an altar to which she must bring a faithful offering. Caleb slept on, but he had become her covenant in another manner. His small, steady life an argument against leaving. If she abandoned the house, she knew, he would again learn how it was to be set aside. That possibility made her hands clench in the dark. Then, in a season when the leaves turned and fell in a slow, tremulous rain of their own, the county clerk's office finally signed the papers. Clara returned with an official envelope and a small, almost mischievous smile. She set the deed upon the table and placed her hand over it as if to make the house's claim feel less like ink and more like something with heat. The signing was quiet. It required only the pen's scratch, a signature, and the clerk's small, efficient nod. The papers made the Bridger house in a new way, an object of law and of memory both, bound and affirmed. Nora watched the pen's path with a sensation like relief colliding with fear. The deed changed the house's relationship to the world. It made her a steward in a way that no longer carried the ambiguity of trespass. But the act itself did not alter the work. Wood still needed to be split. Food needed to be grown. People needed to be watched over when they were sick and remembered when they died. When the sheriff had once recorded that no body decayed on this farm, Nora now took that as a charge she could carry with both hands. On an evening when snow dusted the porch and the stove's iron gave a low, contented chime, Nora looked through the window at the smoke like a small flag, and felt the house answer back in a way that had less to do with supernatural preservation than with an abundance made by many hands. The farm did not defy the seasons, it acknowledged them and then bent itself to meet them with warmth and neighborliness. The sheriff's phrase, when she thought of it now, read less like a curiosity and more like a community's verdict. Those who came here would not be forgotten. There were more trials ahead, the occasional illness that required a neighbor's skill, a bad year where crops thinned to a fine worry, the long negotiation of a market that sometimes cheated the small holders. Yet with each hard day, the house's rhythm settled into a pattern that felt like a slow music. Caleb grew taller, his cough a softer thing. Mary found work at a schoolhouse a few miles over and visited with preserves. Elias rode his routes and left small parcels of news or a packet of seeds. Joe took to sitting on the porch some evenings, his boots kicked up as he told a tale that, in its telling, grew larger and truer. And the letters, Samuel's letters, remained a holy inventory. Nora read them often and sometimes aloud, so that the house could hear its past and fold it into the present. She would bring the tin box from beneath the quilts and let Caleb sift through the folded papers while she scraped the pan clean. The words nourished them in a peculiar way. They were fuel for a life that took shape in acts rather than slogans. At night, when the house settled and the wind moved like a hand across the plain, Nora would stand with her palms pressed to the stove's warm iron and think of what it had been to live without a hearth. The memory of cold took on a distant, almost historic quality, something she had once known as if another woman in another life had been the one to suffer. She had become not only a keeper of a house, but an inheritor of a promise etched into wood and ink. There were whispers, always, from the edge of town about the sheriff's recorded phrase. Travelers asked at the inn, and then asked again on the road whether there had been some miracle there. Old men, thick with the taste of a hard life, told stories that placed an impossible literalness into the words. Nora listened and smiled when such tales reached the house. The truth, she thought, was quieter and more stubborn. No body decayed here because people did not let memory wither. The house had a way of making room, and those who came were given a note in the ledger of life. One evening, as a frost kept its edges on the grass and the stove sang in a steady tone, a knock came at the door. Nora opened it and found a thin figure in a threadbare cloak. The man's eyes were a startling, watchful thing. He introduced himself as a sheriff's deputy from a neighboring county. He had a ledger with him and a face that had the practiced neutrality of men who carried law across distances. In his hand he carried an old record, an account that some time ago had been filed and had taken on the peculiar name the sheriff had written years earlier. "I was sent to collect the account," he said, and his voice had the monotone of someone who had uttered that sentence many times. "People speak of your place. The sheriff asked I come with his regards. He left something, wrote it down, said it may save your house from being forgotten." Nora's breath caught, not for fear of bureaucratic claim, but because the phrase returned to her with a resonance that was almost tender. "We keep the place warm," she said. "That's what we do." The deputy nodded, as if that answer satisfied. He slid the ledger into the fold of his coat and stood with a sort of patient respect that made Nora think of Elias on the road. He had come with a record and had left with an understanding that here was a house that did not merely stand, but was tended. When he was gone, the house seemed to inhale and exhale like a living thing, and Nora found herself smiling at the stove's black face. Caleb came in with a bundle of kindling, cheeks bright from the cold. He placed his hand on the iron, feeling the heat seep into his palm, and then he looked at Nora, as if some question sat on his tongue. "Will it always be this way?" he asked, the child's voice turning the question bluntly. Nora considered. The truth of the frontier was that nothing was ever guaranteed.
There were storms yet unseen, and debts yet to be exacted. But when she looked out the window at the thin plume of smoke and the neighbors' lanterns across the valley, she felt the architecture of belonging settle like mortar in her chest. "We will keep at it," she said, "as long as we keep the stove fed and the doors open. A house is nothing without people inside to remember it." She could see in Caleb's small face the way that promise would anchor a future. He closed his hand around the wooden horse and shook it with the sound a child makes to test whether a thing still works. The house answered with the old click of the iron and the crack of a log. When the sheriff's recorded account, when talk of a farm where nobody,
Decayed, filtered to other places, it became something larger than a single farm. People began to come not because of rumor of oddness, but because someone had said that there was a place where no one was set aside. They came carrying burdens and left some of them behind. They came with their small demands and with their small mercies. Nora learned to measure each act of giving and receiving by whether it stoked the stove of belonging. Outside, the plain moved through its seasons. The snow came and stayed, and then gave up to a wary spring. The house endured the weather with a steadiness that surprised even Nora. It was not invulnerable. Sometimes the stove smoked when the draft turned wrong, and sometimes a neighbor's illness made the house's generosity seem insufficient. But across those uncertain days, a pattern held. Hands came to mend, food arrived in modest but weighty amounts, and the ledger's neat lines assured that the house's name would not vanish. The Bridger house had become a small hub in the valley, and as such it accumulated stories. A man who had once been homeless sat for a while and hewed a new table that bears the mark of his knife. A woman learned to braid a rope of hay that would hold tight through winter. Children learned to make kites from newspaper and string, and the house's eaves watched them fly like small, colorful thoughts against the sky. But still, the letters pulled at Nora. She read Samuel's final note one by one until the sentences had the feel of prayer and the sturdiness of instructions. They taught her more than how to nail and sew. They taught her to look for the ways in which a person might be set aside and to make a deliberate reckoning against that impulse. If a sick neighbor lay too easily forgotten, the house would choose otherwise. If a child's clothes were threadbare, a patch would be made. If an old man's stories grew thin with retelling, the house gathered them as if they were coins to be saved. And so the farm where nobody decayed did what names and laws could not accomplish alone. It kept people in the day-to-day habit of remembering. The sheriff's recorded account might have been the origin of the phrase, but the truth of it rested in the daily acts of those who lived within the house's walls. It became something of a covenant, not by ink, but by labor and care. The seasons turned again, and with their turning, there came the subtle and certain truth that the Bridger house had been transformed not by miracle, but by attention. The stove became not only the machine that warmed them, but the symbol of a work ethic that required presence and persistence. It ticked and sighed with the patience of a thing that had been well tended. Yet even with all that, Nora carried a secret fear. What if their small wealth of care, their ledger of kindness, could not stave off the worst? What if an illness came that took more than broth and bed could give? She did not speak the fear aloud, but it lived in the way she kept the medicine jar full, in the way she mended Caleb's mittens, even when there were better things to spend the last of their coin on. The house, for all its solidity, had taught Nora to live between hope and preparation. She had learned to expect both kindness and hardship, and she had learned to measure her days by the small acts that made up the larger life. The sheriff's recorded phrase, odd, almost theatrical, had long since become less a riddle and more an ethic. The farm, where nobody decayed, was the place where people were remembered and tended, not because fate decreed it, but because people chose, day by small day, to keep the hearth. On the eve when the ledger returned to the county clerk and the last of the signatures dried, Nora stood by the stove and felt less like a woman who had been rescued, then a steward who had come into her office with a full knowledge of what work it required. The house's beams settled, the children laughed in the attic, and Clara Bridger sat at the table and hummed a tune that rose like steam. Outside, smoke made a flag in the night and drew back to the sky. Nora placed Samuel's letters into the tin once more, wrapped them with oilcloth, and set them beneath the quilts. She thought of the sheriff who had written the curious phrase, and of Clara's steady hands and Elias's road-worn patience. She thought of Caleb's laugh and Mary's quiet gratitude. The name painted in the ledger might remain odd to those who heard it in other towns, but here it meant something precise and stubborn, a place where the living refused to let the living be forgotten. The house breathed, and in its breathing, Nora found herself willing to answer its call. She would keep the stove hot, the door open enough for those in need, and a ledger of names that would not let people vanish. It was a promise that asked little in pay and returned much in life. Outside, the valley slept under a thin frost. A single plume of smoke wavered from the chimney, and somewhere beyond the light, a rider pulled his horse to the gate and listened for the human sounds that would tell him whether he should cross the threshold. The Bridger house, with its iron heart and the memory of Samuel's hand, stood as a small but firm answer to the long question of how a place holds a people. And inside, by the stove, Nora folded her hands and felt warmth like a benediction. The farm had been given a name by a sheriff's clerk years before. She had given it life by choice. Acts, ink and labor, made a new thing together, a home where the bones of a place were kept alive by those who would not let it be otherwise. The smoke continued to rise, silent as a flag, and the house kept its light against the night.